They said he'd never make it because of his skin. Now he runs a $1 billion tech empire. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Marlon James Moody walked down High Street as he always did, slightly off to the side of the crowd. It was early morning, and the yellow sun was slowly rising over the city, struggling to break through the haze hanging over Oakland. His shoes were full of sand and dust from the day before. The shoes themselves had long outlived their usefulness. The soles were worn down, the laces were tied twice, and the right one was a different color. But the real issue was the bag hanging off his shoulder, a worn-out backpack with cracked zippers, inside of which were a notebook, a screwdriver, two capacitors, an old microcontroller schematic, and a crumpled piece of paper with addresses of places he had already written to and gotten a no in return. He grew up on the east side of Oakland, in a neighborhood where houses made of yellow brick seemed like they were condemned. The neighbors knew each other, knew who sold, who sewed, who drank. In the evenings, the streets emptied out, and even the cops drove by quickly. His mother, Dorothy, worked the night shift at a hospital 10 miles away. After his father, a firefighter, died in a call when Marlon was 9, she never talked about the future. Only about getting through to Monday. At school, they called him Marlon the Nerd, with an emphasis on the last syllable, almost threateningly. He didn't play basketball, didn't listen to G-Funk, didn't wear T-shirts with wrappers on them. He had thick notebooks filled with notes in the margins and blueprints in grid paper, often the kind that even the teachers couldn't understand. That's what they laughed at. They'd say, "You'll never make it. This stuff isn't for people like us." This morning he left early. He didn't have enough money for the bus, so he walked toward downtown, toward the skyscrapers. That's where the companies, startups, and agencies were. Everything that seemed like part of another world. One of them had agreed to meet him, the technical director of a small tech company specializing in interfaces for embedded systems. Marlon had read about them in the paper and sent an email without expecting a response. But one came, not from the director, but from a junior manager. Polite, dry, but with a date and time. He was surprised. Then he believed. The office was on the second floor of a glass and concrete building, at the corner of a street where windows change faster than subway ads. At the entrance stood a woman in a suit talking on the phone. Marlon greeted her, but she didn't respond. Inside, there was a reception desk with a white table behind it, and a young man with a perfect haircut and a slightly condescending smile. "Hello, I'm here to see Mr. Talbot. I have an appointment," Marlon said, carefully pulling out the letter from his inner pocket and handing it over. The guy behind the desk looked him over, his shoes, pants, backpack, and didn't take the letter. He tapped a few keys on his laptop, then said, "I don't see you in the system. Are you sure? Is this for an interview or a delivery?" I applied for an internship. I got a reply from... This is probably a mistake. We don't take anyone without a degree, especially for engineering positions. You should probably look for something more suitable," he said almost automatically, without any aggression. Marlon nodded, said understood, turned around and walked out. He didn't feel angry or offended, just that familiar weight in his chest, the one that comes when the world reminds you, this isn't for people like you. He sat on the curb by the bus stop, pulled out his notebook, tore out the page with the company's name on it, crumpled it, tossed it in the trash, and kept walking. At the corner of 45th Street, he paused in front of an electronics store window. Inside, a large screen was showing a conference recording from San Francisco. A tall white guy in a black turtleneck was talking about the future of technology, how interfaces would become intuitive, how humans and machines would interact on the level of nerve impulses. He spoke beautifully, confidently, nodding along to his own rhythm. The audience in the hall, people in suits, all from another world, didn't look anything like Marlon. Not by clothing, not by background, not by expectations. A group of kids passing by shouted, "Hey, nerd, watching TV again." and laughed. He didn't respond. He never did, because words were useless. He just stared at the screen and tried to figure out what exactly made them them and him him. What was stopping him from standing on that stage? Money? Skin color? A lack of a degree? Or all of it together? He didn't get home until later in the evening, or rather to what they called home, a room on the second floor of an old house that used to be for students and now was for people with nowhere else to go. A shared kitchen, shared bathroom, sometimes a shared TV with an antenna that picked up 3 channels. His mom wasn't back from her shift yet. He ate peanut butter on bread, then went down to the basement. It was cold and smelled musty, but it was the only place where no one bothered him. On the table lay the board he'd saucered the day before. A few wires, a battery, the casing of an old disassembled recorder. He checked the connections again, jotted it down in his notebook, tested the signal. The board powered up, the indicator light blinked for a second. He didn't smile, just wrote down the result. It was one of dozens of attempts to make something functional out of the junk he found near electronics stores, at sales, in abandoned boxes, under stairwells. Sometimes he thought, if only he had access to the right equipment, the knowledge, the community, how much faster could he go? But no one gave him that, because he wasn't from the right background. He lay down on the floor in the basement, next to the boxes and parts. He didn't aim to be a billionaire. He just wanted to prove that he could, that this isn't for people like you was a lie, even if it took years. And while footsteps and doors slammed above him in the basement of the old house, the work continued, alone, in the dust, without guarantees, but with hope, because hope hadn't died yet. Marlon still wore the same worn-out shoes from a year ago. The insoles were gone, and he could feel every stone on the pavement as he walked through the streets of Oakland. Downtown was bustling with the white-collar crowd, confident in their right to be there. But in the evening, everything changed. The noise quieted, and the air filled with the smell of gasoline, cheap cigarettes, and overcooked meat. Here he felt invisible, not in the sense that he wasn't noticed. He was noticed. It was just that everyone had already decided who he was. He kept learning. In the evenings, it was in the basement of the shelter, surrounded by salvaged radio parts. At night, he was in the reading room of the homeless library where the lights went out at midnight. One of those nights, he noticed a guy in a ripped hoodie holding a spray can, painting graffiti on the wall. He wasn't running away. He worked calmly like an artist, line after line. That was Joe Michael. "I've seen you sit with your books for hours," Joe Michael said without turning. "You're not reading. You're scanning. Guess you're one of the extras too." That's how their first conversation started. Joe Michael was the type of person the school had already given up on. His mother had died of an overdose, and his father had left when he was 10. He lived with his aunt, but spent more nights in clubs and on rooftops. He had an incredible memory for visual images and an innate sense of composition. He drew schematics and interfaces without knowing a thing about design. He didn't care about money. He just wanted to leave a mark and to finally be seen. A couple of weeks later, Marlon invited Joe Michael to an old community center on the outskirts of town. The place hadn't been a hub for anything in ages. The pipes were sticking out of the windows were boarded up, and the inside smelled of mildew and old paper. But in the basement, there was an outlet, and behind one door, a dusty old conference room they called the base. There, an enormous wooden table and a few broken chairs sat, waiting. It was the perfect place for Marlon to bring those who could share not just ideas, but the burden. First came Lucia. She worked the cash register at a pharmacy, but took night classes to become a nurse. Her brother had died of diabetes when they were both 15. They didn't have the money for his treatment. Lucia dreamed of creating a simple device that could help people like him. Cheap, accessible, and easy to use. She didn't believe in startups, business, or the world of venture capital, but she believed in data, in measurements, in biometrics, and she believed that someone had to start thinking about the poor. Marlon just said, "We need you." That was all that was needed. The last to join was Han. His family had moved from Seoul when he was a kid. His dad owned an auto shop, his mom cleaned offices. Han figured out early that to avoid being tech support on minimum wage, you had to think ahead. He got into building computers, and in high school, he put together his first laptop with parts ordered by mail. They kicked him out for hacking the school Wi-Fi, not because of the hack, but because of his last name and his accent. He worked at an electronics store and wrote scripts at night. When Marlon told him about the biosensor idea, Han didn't ask a single question. He just said, "I can do this." The idea was simple in theory, but almost impossible in practice. A small device that attaches to the body and reads real-time health metrics. Blood sugar, pressure, pulse, cortisol levels, all in one chip. No needles, no tests, no expensive procedures. They gathered at the center every evening. Lucia brought medical textbooks and charts. Han brought soldering irons and scraps of circuit boards. Joe Michael sketched interfaces on an old-school chalkboard. Marlon coordinated everything, writing down, structuring, comparing. He was the engine. They were the hands and hearts. This wasn't a company, it was a refuge, a place where no one laughed when you said the word future. But the real world had no idea about their basement, and it didn't want to. They wrote their first grant applications, 28 in 3 months. They were rejected every time. Some with formal rejections like, "not aligned with our priorities." Others with outright mockery. One fund set up a video call. On the screen, 2 white guys in suits sitting in a brightly lit office. "So, you're from Oakland, and your office is in the basement?" "We're temporarily using a community center," Marlon answered, keeping it calm. "Right. Well, good luck with that. We're looking for something a bit more scalable, something with a serious team." When the call ended, Joe Michael stayed silent. Then he stood up and slammed his fist on the table. He didn't know how to stay cool. He burned with frustration. But Marlon just opened the next application, filled out the form again, and sent it off. One night after a particularly rough rejection from a venture fund, where they had been told outright, "You're wasting our time," Lucia left early. She didn't say a word, just placed the medical textbook on the table and walked out. Marlon didn't stop her. He knew this time words wouldn't help. Han stayed. He pulled out his soldering iron and without looking up said quietly, "I'm not the type to quit. I didn't come here for the money, but if you say tomorrow this is the end, I'll understand." Marlon stood up, walked over to the window. Through the dusty glass, there was a streetlight and shadows cast by a wire fence. There was no future in this place, only persistence. He didn't turn around, just said, "This isn't the end." And so in complete silence, they spent that night. Joe Michael sketched a new schematic. Han worked on the circuit board, and Marlon wrote. Not inspiring speeches, not press releases. He drew the details of the design. Protocols, logistics, the stuff no one notices if the project fails, and the things that will matter if it survives. The next week, Lucia came back. She didn't explain why she left. She just brought a new medical textbook and silently sat down at the table. In this basement, no one demanded apologies, just participation. The team was formed. They called themselves Fifth Floor, a nod to the idea that their ideas were too high for those afraid to rise. But really, it was because the old college library building, where they soon found their secret room, was on the 5th floor. No one went up there. The elevator was broken and the stairs creaked. But to them, it became home. They didn't feel like heroes. They didn't believe in success. What united them was one simple truth. No one needed them, but they had a plan, and it wasn't dead yet. Dust settled in their noses as Marlon pushed the door to the 5th floor of the old college library in the Highland District. The stairs creaked underfoot. The railing hadn't been painted in years, and the wires hung exposed along the walls. The building was partly abandoned. Funding for the college barely covered the basics, and the fifth floor had long been forgotten, except by them. The fifth floor team, this is what they started calling themselves, moved here after they were kicked out of the community center. Someone had broken a window, and the manager decided that these troublesome young people with wires and soldering irons were a security risk. They had nowhere to work. So Marlon convinced a night course instructor, Martin Farrow, to let them use the old equipment storage as a lab, under the guise of lab practice. Farrow waved him off. "Just no fires, okay?" Marlon nodded. He wasn't joking. The room on the fifth floor was narrow but long. Concrete walls, old linoleum on the floor, bubbled up in places from moisture. The windows wouldn't open. The ventilation didn't work. In the winter, it was like a freezer, and in the summer, like an oven. But for them, it became a refuge, a home where no one judged your accent, the color of your skin, or your secondhand clothes. In the corner, an old Apple II sat broken. Han had begged his neighbor for an old motherboard, patched it up as best he could. That's where they started writing their first lines of code. Marlon wrote the program by hand in a notebook, and Lucia transferred it into the compiler. Joe Michael was in charge of physical assembly. He had a knack for working with his hands, though he just called himself the urban mechanic. They lived off peanut butter and bread, sometimes instant noodles that Lucia brought from her second job as a waitress at a Mexican joint. She often got to take home leftovers. Once a week, chicken, a celebration. Marlon's mother, Dorothy, was coughing more at night. She still worked at the hospital, but the strain was starting to show. Diabetes, which she'd been dealing with for years, was beginning to cause complications. But the insurance didn't cover her treatment. Too low on the ladder for that. At night, Marlon would sit with her, measure her blood sugar with an old glucometer, help her get up. He didn't complain anymore. Just tired. In the morning, he'd go back to the fifth floor, write more formulas, argue with Han about why the circuit wasn't working. Every 2 weeks, they did pitches, sending presentations to investors they found in college catalogs or online forums. The responses were always the same. Interesting, but not for us. Wrong team. Too rough. Once they went to a meeting in person. Han bought a second-hand jacket. Lucia borrowed heels. A white man in his 50s sat across from them, flipping through the presentation without looking up. "You really think someone's going to give you millions for this?" he said, almost indifferently, like he was commenting on the weather. "Be realistic." After that meeting, Joe Michael stayed silent for 2 days. Then he started drinking. Said he was out. This idea is not for anyone. But a week later, he came back. No explanation. Just stood by the door, silently looked at the circuit, and began soldering. A year passed. Their clothes hung loosely on them. Everyone was underweight. Money was almost gone. Lucia's small side jobs, Joe Michael's shifts at the car wash, the occasional transfers from Han's parents. All of it went toward parts, wires, equipment, food, medication for Dorothy. Marlon didn't spend a cent on himself. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd slept more than 4 hours. But one rainy, quiet night, when the raindrops pounded against the closed window and the room smelled of overheated soldering iron and damp socks, it worked. The prototype. It was the size of a subway token. It read basic biosignals, pulse, blood oxygen, approximate blood glucose level, and sent the data to an old laptop running a basic program. There were errors, but it worked. It responded. It was alive. Lucia screamed first. Hans slammed his fist on the table. Joe Michael hugged Marlon, who flinched, not used to physical contact. But he stood still, just stared at the blinking green light. His eyes were dry. He didn't even smile. He just said, "We did it. No fanfare, no medals, no audience, no signed contracts or cozy office spaces. Just a concrete ceiling, the hum of an old system unit, and exhaustion in every movement." But they had a prototype, not for the fame, But to prove they hadn't wasted the year, to prove they existed, soon Marlon's mother was bedridden. He came home, changed her bandages, fed her with a spoon, refused to sleep. One day she looked at him and said, "You look like your father did in his last weeks, but your eyes, they're different. He had emptiness in his. You have fire in yours." He didn't answer, just took her hand. That was their last conversation where she spoke clearly. A week later, she stopped speaking. The fifth floor became a symbol, a legend in their small circle. Each of them understood, if it ended now, no one would remember. Not the investors, not the media, not Professor Farrow, who'd already begun avoiding conversations. But something had changed inside them. Each of them. Hans stopped being self-conscious about his accent. Lucia started learning management basics, saying one day she'd handle negotiations. Joe Michael didn't drink anymore. He just silently sketched future versions. And Marlon, he still arrived first and left last. Still wore his worn backpack with his notebook. But now, instead of a notebook full of rejection letters, there was a circuit diagram, the one that worked. The chapter ended not with victory, but with a step, a small, humble one. The kind that's often left out of billionaire biographies. But without it, there are no finales. Because for them, it wasn't a project, it was a life. And the fifth floor, its beginning. It was that moment when it seemed everything they had worked for might fall apart in a day. Marlon stood in line at the entrance to the Berkeley University Center, feeling the tension rise in his chest. In his mind, there was only one question. What if we don't fit in again? The fifth floor team had already survived a lot. A year of working in an abandoned lab on the fifth floor of an old college building, where the windows were boarded up, and all the equipment was outdated and half broken. But they made it. They created a prototype. It worked. And now at this contest, at this university, they had a chance they couldn't afford to miss. But the security guard at the entrance looked at Marlon, standing there in his gray hoodie and jeans, and didn't immediately let him through. He tried to pretend he hadn't noticed the look, but even so, the tension in his body grew. They didn't have invitations. They didn't look the part. They didn't belong to any of the categories typically expected at these events. "What are you here for?" the guard asked, and Marlon, feeling his throat tighten, tried to play it cool. "We're here for the innovation contest," he said calmly, putting everything he had, his honesty and determination, into his words. "We've got a spot here." Shaking his head, the guard reluctantly stepped aside, letting them pass. Lucia walked beside him, her expression revealing the same tension as Marlon's. You could see it in the way her lips pressed together, despite her composure. After passing through several floors lined with empty walls, adorned with strange posters and announcements, the team finally reached the hall where the competition was taking place. It was a massive, packed conference room with people in expensive suits already taking their seats. Most of them looked perfectly prepared, with presentations on screens and teams ready to shine. There was everything here, from companies with multi-million-dollar budgets to well-funded startups. And of course, the ambitious students ready to sell their ideas. Those who didn't belong in this world, they stood out immediately. And when their eyes first met the judges, Marlon felt his heart freeze. Among the people sitting at the table was Vince Caruana. This man, white and narrow-minded when it came to startups, was the same one who had rejected their attempts months ago. His gaze radiated nothing but disdain and detachment, and when he saw the name of their team, Marlon couldn't help but notice how his lips curled into a slight smirk. It was hard to tell what struck Marlon more, his face full of contempt or the fact that he and his team had ended up in front of him again. They didn't expect any kindness from him. "You," Vince said, glancing over their documents. His voice was cold, almost condescending, with a touch of something sinister. "This isn't your level. I doubt your proposal will be of any interest." His look was such that Marlon could swear he didn't believe in any of their ideas. But they kept going, without words, without arguing. They had this chance, not just to prove it to Vince, but to themselves. When it was time for their presentation, the team moved to the stage. The old projector, the one they'd used to sketch out all their ideas over the last 2 years, suddenly came to life. On the screen appeared the schematics of their biosensor, which still seemed like something distant and unrealistic to most. Han, focused, clicked through the slides. Lucia stood next to him, poised, and Marlon, always composed, kept talking about their innovation. He wasn't trying to please anyone. He was just showing what they had created, fully aware that his words might go unheard. A hush fell over the room. Students, staff, investors. They were all listening, but their minds weren't on the innovation. They were distracted by what they were used to seeing in places like this. Lucia noticed one of the investors, young, in an expensive suit, quickly jotting something down on his tablet, clearly cursing everything they were saying. He was the type of person who already considered their idea a lost cause. But in that moment, the prototype was working. Data began flashing on the screen, clear and precise. Vince Caruana wasn't impressed. He jotted something down and shook his head. He wasn't ready to welcome them into his world. But there was another person in the room, an older professor, who looked like he could have been one of them. This man came up to them after the presentation, ignoring all the barriers, and asked who they were, what their team was about. "You have a future," he said, his words like rain in a desert. It wasn't just a compliment. It was faith, a belief that Marlon built the next step on. At that moment, he didn't smile. He couldn't relax because he knew there was still a fight ahead. As the team walked out of the hall, Marlon didn't look at them. He just kept walking. They had just won a grant, but there was something more important to him. He realized this wasn't the end. It was a new milestone. He didn't know what was next, but he knew one thing. They wouldn't back down, and they would never see themselves as those who owed anyone anything. On their way out, Marlon glanced at the display case. On the screen of the TV that had so often drawn his gaze, there was a report about the competition. On one of the host's faces, you could read that they were probably not the main story of the day. But that didn't matter. He didn't care what others were saying. He was focused only on what was in front of him. This moment was theirs, but there was so much more ahead. The end of the chapter illustrates how their group, despite their fear, exhaustion, and social isolation, continues to take steps forward. Not for recognition, but for faith in themselves and the belief that even in a world full of bias, there's a place to make their mark. 5 years passed, and a lot had changed. Marlon's company, Theramod, had entered the elite ranks of tech startups. Their biosensor prototype, once considered impossible, was now seen as revolutionary. It was being implemented in clinics treating diabetes, chronic diseases, and other ailments. Many people with disabilities or those who couldn't afford a high-quality treatment now had a chance at a normal life. But for Marlon, despite all the external successes, this path was far from easy. His struggle continued. The company, despite its technological achievements, always remained in the shadows. When they entered the market, they didn't immediately become favorites. Marlon and his team kept working with the same sense of uncertainty they'd started with. Only now that weight had become even heavier. The outside world hailed them as heroes. But as is often the case, the real battle remained hidden from view. Their strength didn't lie in becoming great in the eyes of others, but in leaving their mark in a world that rarely acknowledged their existence. Marlon was no longer that young guy sitting on a bench in Oakland, staring at the TV in the display case, dreaming of becoming something bigger. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a team. Joe Michael, always confident and with a sharp sense of humor, hadn't changed a bit. He was the one who could lift the team's spirits when things weren't going well. His street art, his ability to draw attention and break stereotypes, was now finding its place in the business world. But for him, like for the others, every new success was just another reminder of how hard their journey had been. Lucia and Han were the ones working behind the scenes, crunching numbers, creating schematics, and fine-tuning algorithms. Lucia, with her Mexican roots, understood what it was like to battle against the system when you came from less. Han, raised in poverty, knew that being Asian in this world didn't automatically earn you respect. All those differences, the pain, the unacknowledged struggles, they turned into one shared goal, creating something that could change the world. And they did it. Theramod had become a symbol of what people with backgrounds like theirs could and should be able to do, change the future. They were the driving force of change, inspiring others to dream and never give up. But despite all that, a sign still hung in their office, which had become their creed. Our story started with rejection. One day, as Marlon walked to his office through the old buildings downtown, he saw the same TV in the store window, the one that had once become a symbol of his dream. This TV now showed a report about how Theramod had launched a new revolutionary product. He smiled, but there was no joy in it, just weariness. He knew real success didn't come instantly. It came only after you had faced rejection and humiliation. That day, Marlon sat in his office, which was no longer quite so small. The windows overlooked the city, his desk was covered with papers, and the walls were lined with awards and recognitions that once seemed out of reach. His team was in the next room, and he was lost in thought. He thought about his journey, how once everyone had laughed at him, how no one believed in his dreams, and how hard it had been to find people who shared his vision. Now, after all these years with their company recognized, Marlon knew their success wasn't just the result of a brilliant idea. It was the result of a struggle, a systemic battle against prejudices, against those who had seen him and his team as second class, against those who shut doors in their faces without even trying to understand what they could bring to the world. When Marlon looked at his team, he felt pride. They hadn't just created a product that was changing the world. They had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of those who had been ignored, who had always been on the margins. They had won because they believed their ideas were worth more than the biased views trying to stop them. His thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was Vince Caruana, the white investor from San Francisco who had once turned them down, calling them too unpromising and too weird, was now calling to congratulate them. Marlon immediately recognized the tone in his voice, genuine surprise and a little bit of acknowledgement, which Marlon, of course, wasn't seeking. "Congratulations. You've become what we couldn't see in you 5 years ago," Vince said. Marlon stayed silent, unsure of how to respond. He didn't need recognition from people like him. He already knew that everything he had achieved had nothing to do with this world that tried to dictate the rules. But what Vince couldn't understand, what still mattered to Marlon, was not the recognition. It was the fact that now they could afford to hire people whom no one else ever noticed. They had opened doors for those who, like them once, only ever heard rejection. Marlon looked away from the window and stood up. He knew new challenges were waiting for them ahead, but today, in this moment, he was ready to face them. Ideas for the next step were already spinning in his head. They were ready to fight for new technologies, but most importantly, they had already proven to everyone that their place in this world was real. Marlon stood on the stage in a large auditorium that had once been out of reach for him. In his hands was an old notebook, the same one he'd started with. The eyes of the room were on him, thousands of them, many different faces, among them not just white faces like before, but people like him, and those who had grown up in neighborhoods where success was a dream that seemed unattainable to most. The room was packed, not just with students, but with representatives from various organizations, investors and startup founders, all eager to know what the future of technology would hold. But this time, Marlon didn't feel like he had back at the beginning. He wasn't standing before a crowd, relying on his inner strength to keep from giving up. He knew they were listening. Young faces stared at him with genuine interest, with something that had once seemed impossible to Marlon: respect. He wasn't going to talk about money. They knew he was rich. That didn't matter. What mattered was the story, the journey he had walked, and that journey was worth far more than any numbers in a bank account. On that stage, there was only one thing: memory. He could still feel that spark inside him, the same one that had burned in his chest when he was just a teenager with dreams and no money. But now that spark was much brighter. Over the years, he had learned to be not only an entrepreneur, but a mentor. What he had started now inspired others. He wasn't a legend to himself. He was an example for those who had always felt like their chances of success were minimal. My story started with rejection, he whispered to himself, recalling those times when every step had been hard-earned, when every door had been slammed shut. There had never been a moment when everything had gone according to plan. But now on this stage, he wasn't facing the same people who had once doubted his abilities. Now those spots were filled by others, those who understood him like no one else could. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that he was holding in his hands not just an old notebook, but a symbol of the fight. A notebook where dreams were written down, dreams that didn't come true when he had no money, no experience, and all the doors were shut in his face. You know, when I was a teenager, I couldn't get into university because I didn't have enough points. I couldn't get into startups because I was black. I couldn't break into other fields because I wasn't what they expected to see in those roles. I dreamed of a future, but reality kept handing me rejection after rejection. The room fell silent. Tension hung in the air, but Marlon kept going. And now, here I am, standing before you. I'm not going to talk about money, and I'm not going to talk about our company, which, by the way, is worth $1 billion now. I'll tell you this. We were always about something else. We made it through those rejections. We were turned away, just like many of you. And I can tell you, if I could go back, I wouldn't trade that for an easy road. He paused, looking into the eyes of the students, letting his inner confidence and calmness speak through his gaze. Our company, our story, it's not just the success that came with the tech revolution. We didn't become an exception. We became those who wanted people like us to be seen. We became the ones who reached out to those who have always been in the shadows. Marlon couldn't help but remember how, 10 years ago, when he sat on the steps of a university campus, watching other students rush by with their tablets, he knew he would never get into that campus. He was too wrong for those people. But today he was here with real results, with a real team, with success. He had proven that you could make it through the system without giving into it. He had become part of that new wave, unstoppable and determined. This wasn't just his achievement. It was the achievement of everyone who ever said no to him. Those who doubted, who laughed at his dreams. It was the achievement of the marginalized, because now they were part of this victory too. The Theramod office was no longer just a building where biosensors were made. It had become a symbol of change, a symbol of how one person, one team, pushed to the margins, could create something bigger than just a profitable company. It became home to people who had been rejected by the system, but had gone on to change that system. Once in their room on the 5th floor, Marlon and his friends worked through the nights, living on mac and cheese and peanut butter. And now they sat in offices with views of the city, working alongside others, people just like them. Dreamers, but with no real chance. Marlon's team was his greatest strength. Joe Michael, the street artist with his vibrant charisma, his loud shirts, and his laughter that lightened the heavy nights. He was the one who inspired them to keep fighting, even when it felt pointless. Lucia, the Mexican powerhouse with work ethic and confidence, was his right hand, while Han, the Korean genius, was the mind behind all their tech solutions. Each one was in their place. Each one had walked their own painful path of rejection. But in the end, they had all found their way to success. And now, as Marlon stood before this audience, he realized he wasn't alone. He was part of something much bigger than just a tech company. He had become an example for those who didn't believe in themselves. He was living proof that the impossible is possible. The room filled with applause. It wasn't just gratitude for his story. It was applause of respect, acknowledgement, and understanding. It was the recognition of the journey they had all taken together, and now they were seen. Marlon fell silent. He stood on the stage, feeling each gaze in the room, not just attention, but recognition. He could have ended his speech with dry facts or another thank you, but today, in this moment, he understood that the words he was about to say could change someone's life. He exhaled and looked into the eyes of the students, the faces of those who had come with their own dreams, and maybe their doubts. "I stood where you are," he said, his voice softening, but not losing any of its conviction. "I looked at people who seemed to have it all, and I thought, why can't I be like that? Why aren't I getting the same chances?" He paused, letting those words sink in, giving them the space to penetrate the hearts of the people in the room. "But you know what? The world's not fair. It's not going to hand you gifts. It's not going to say, here's your chance, take it and run. And if you're waiting for someone to say, you deserve this, well, you might never hear it. But what you can do is create your own story, your own reality. It won't be easy, and it won't be without pain. You will fall. They will judge you. They will doubt you. And at some point, you'll want to quit." Marlon glanced at his old friends. Joe Michael, Lucia, Han. They had been with him since the beginning. He remembered their first steps, the nights they spent together when it seemed like the whole world was against them, when all the doors were shut and they were desperately trying to find any crack to move forward. "But that," he smiled slightly, "that's life. And if I hadn't met these people, if we hadn't done what we did, we wouldn't be standing here today. We wouldn't be the ones who can say, we did it." He looked at his listeners, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Even those who had come out of curiosity could feel how Marlon's words were cutting deep. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't. Don't let anyone take away your belief in yourself, because it's that belief and determination that can turn the impossible into possible. Yes, the road will be long, it won't be comfortable, but if you truly want something, you can achieve it. The room erupted in applause once more, but Marlon remained standing, absorbed in the thought that his words weren't just lifting him up. They were lifting the people who had once been on the same path he had. Those who listened to him could understand. It's not all lost. You can get up, keep going, and achieve what's yours. "I'm not saying this as a billionaire," he added with a slight smile. "I'm saying this as a guy from the street who set a goal once and didn't quit. I'm the guy who couldn't get in here before, and you can do the same." He fell silent, letting those words sink into the hearts of every person in that room. Then with a slight bow, he concluded, "If you like this story, if you want to hear more about how other people fight and win, if you need more inspiration to keep going, subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more stories like this, real, authentic, and maybe even yours." As Marlon walked off the stage, he felt that these words weren't just motivational, they were the truth. And if even one person in the room, or one viewer online, lifted their eyes toward their future and said to themselves, "I can do this too," then his mission was complete. Because in the end, each of us can be the one who says, "I was where you are, and I rose." Not for money, not for fame, but to prove to myself and the world, if I can do it, you can too. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on more inspiring stories. They might just be the start of your journey.